The knowledge that the church could not save you, that the law could not hold wages, that the Lord could not replace you, Boccaccio could see it assembling. What it became is the question, and the answer starts with something almost nobody says out loud. The plague didn't end.
The second plague pandemic ran from 1347 to 1815, 468 years. Genoa and Naples, cities that had come through the original catastrophe, had not seen plague for 120 years by the time 1656 arrived. Not from 1347. The gap ran from the last outbreak in the early 1500s. They had forgotten what it looked like, and then in 1656 and 1657 lost two-thirds of their populations. Not a third, two-thirds. The mortality of the second wave in those cities exceeded what the initial plague had done 3 centuries earlier. Moscow's epidemic of 1770 to 1771 killed 100,000 people. Sicily lost its last recorded case in 1743. A Sicilian child born in the generation of the American Revolution grew up in a world where the Black Death was a present danger, not a historical one.
When plague arrived in Bombay in 1896, 5.5 centuries after the Black Death, the mortality curve ran the wrong direction for a decade. It got worse before it got better. I sat with that for a while before I understood why, and the reason destroys the version of this story I grew up with.
Humans cannot acquire long-term immunity to Yersinia pestis. That is not a contested finding. The mechanism by which bubonic plague is transmitted, through flea bites, through direct contact with infected tissue, does not produce the kind of durable immune response that protects a population across generations. Every person born after the 1347 wave was as immunologically vulnerable to the pathogen as every person born before it. The population that survived the first pandemic passed nothing forward that would protect their grandchildren from the second.
And the 20th century evidence is almost perverse in how clearly it demonstrates this. When plague arrived in Bombay in 1896, human mortality rates increased for a decade before they started falling, not decreased, increased. The pattern ran in the wrong direction for every theory about human adaptation. And then they fell, not because the human population had changed, but because the rat population had. Rats in India acquired resistance to Y. pestis faster than humans. The mechanism that ended the pandemic was operating in the species that medieval Europeans were actively trying to exterminate as plague vectors, because they correctly identified rats as associated with plague deaths and incorrectly concluded that eliminating rats would eliminate the disease, rather than, in some circumstances, dispersing infected fleas onto human hosts.
The thing nobody mentions is that the quarantine worked. Florence's secular government organized isolation of the sick, restriction of movement, management of the dead. The Decameron's frame, rational community managing its own survival outside failed institutions, maps onto something real that was happening in how cities governed the disease. But the reason quarantine worked was invisible to everyone practicing it. Separating infected people from healthy people interrupted transmission. The people being quarantined thought they were being isolated from miasmatic air. The mechanism they believed in was wrong. The practice it generated was right. A correct behavior derived from an incorrect theory, sustained for 5 centuries because the behavior worked even though nobody understood why.
Which is the modern version of a problem that runs through every scientific institution we have. The gap between a practice that works and a theory that explains why it works. The germ theory of disease doesn't arrive until the 1860s. Semmelweis doesn't publish hand-washing data until 1861. Florence is running effective quarantine protocols in the 1370s, 1380s, 1390s without any conceptual framework that would survive a modern epidemiology course. The practice preceded the understanding by 500 years, and the practice was the thing that mattered.
Carry that forward into what the plague did to European intellectual life, because the pattern runs deeper than quarantine. Charles IV founded Prague's University in 1348, at the peak of mortality. Poland founded Krakow's University in the years following. Vienna's university was refounded under Habsburg support in the same period. More secular universities were established during and immediately after the plague than at any previous time in European history. And what makes the timing so striking is not that people responded to catastrophe with institution building. That's comprehensible enough. What makes it striking is what those institutions were replacing.
The church had held the educational monopoly. If you needed a trained lawyer, a trained physician, a trained administrator, the pathway ran through ecclesiastical networks, the cathedral schools, the monasteries, the church-supervised studia, the formal teaching houses where the church trained the people who ran everything else. What the plague did, by killing clergy at rates comparable to the general population, was destroy the distribution network for specialized knowledge. The priest who knew how to read a legal instrument was dead. The monk who understood land survey was dead. The church's monopoly on literacy was, for the first time, practically untenable, not because anyone had argued against it theologically, but because there were not enough surviving clerics to staff the administrative world that needed staffing.
The document that survives from Charles IV is explicit. He established Prague's university because the plague had destroyed the human infrastructure through which knowledge had previously been transmitted. He was not making a philosophical argument about secular education. He was solving a personnel problem. The empire needed trained people. The church could no longer produce them fast enough, so the emperor built a machine that could. The secular university was not the product of humanist idealism. It was a workforce response to catastrophic institutional failure.
And Boccaccio writing the Decameron in Tuscan vernacular, not Latin, is the same move in a different register. Latin was the language of the church, of the university, of anyone who had been educated through ecclesiastical networks. Tuscan was the language people spoke to each other. Writing a long prose work in Tuscan in the early 1350s was not a stylistic choice. It was a statement about who the audience was and who controlled access to the text. The Council of Trent understood this clearly enough that it produced a censored edition in 1573 that stripped out every cleric, every monastery, every scene of institutional religious life that Boccaccio had held up to examination and found wanting. That censored edition is one of the most useful documents in the archive because the shape of what was removed tells you exactly what the original threatened.
Now, hold that institutional logic alongside what was happening in Eastern Europe simultaneously, because the two things illuminate each other. The Jewish communities that survived the Western massacres migrated east, to Poland primarily, where Casimir III had offered secular protection. The protection worked in Poland for the same reason it failed in the Rhineland. Casimir had sufficient state capacity to enforce a command against local interests, and he had economic reasons to do so. Jewish merchants and financiers were administratively useful to the Polish crown. The protection was not tolerance in any philosophical sense. It was territorial authority extended over a population considered valuable.
And so you get this compound migration pattern. Westward, the pogroms; eastward, the survivors; eastward, simultaneously, the second serfdom intensifying. Two entirely separate responses to the same catastrophe, driven by entirely different mechanisms, both depositing their consequences in the same geographic region. The labor historians who track the second serfdom and the Jewish historians who track the migration east are working in different literatures. Nobody's sitting in the overlap, drawing the line between them.
The overlap closes in the 20th century in a way that demands to be named. The largest Jewish population in Europe by the early 20th century was concentrated in Eastern and Central Europe, precisely because their ancestors had migrated there from plague-era Western massacres. That same region had developed, across the intervening 6 centuries, political economies shaped by the second serfdom, powerful landed nobility, weak urban merchant classes, extreme agrarian inequality, institutional fragility. The specific social conditions that made Eastern Europe more vulnerable to radical authoritarian political projects in the 1920s and 1930s were not caused by the Black Death, but they were structured in ways that are traceable by what the plague years produced. What Voigtlander and Voth found, and we established this in detail earlier, is that the correlation held in cities with no Jewish community for 6 centuries. The implication for everything we've been tracing about institutional encoding is that the structure can outlast every carrier. That last clause is the one that requires sitting with. The methodology in the Quarterly Journal of Economics is controlled enough that it's not simply picking up regional variation in anti-Semitism, not simply reflecting cities that happen to be both medieval centers of Jewish life and later centers of radical nationalism. The researchers isolated cities where Jews were entirely absent from 1349 forward. The correlation persisted. Whatever was being transmitted was not being transmitted through continuous contact with the Jewish population, through ongoing economic competition, through any mechanism that required Jewish people to actually be present. It was transmitting through something in the structure of the city itself.
Which nobody has a clean answer for. The honest position is that we don't fully know what the transmission mechanism was. It could be documented legal precedent. A city that had formally expelled or massacred its Jewish population in 1349 had a legal record establishing who was and who wasn't a member of the civic community, and that record was consulted, cited, built upon. It could be something in the physical organization of the city, the distribution of property that changed hands in 1349, the spatial logic of who lived where afterward. It could be in local chronicles and civic histories that were written, copied, and read across 6 centuries, normalizing a particular account of what the city had done and why it was justified. What's clear is that the cultural memory of organized violence persisted in institutional structures after the victims themselves were gone.
The pattern that keeps appearing across every angle of this research is the same one. The formal structure outlasts the conditions that produced it. The Statute of Laborers was an attempt to preserve a world that no longer existed. The church's educational monopoly was an attempt to maintain authority over knowledge production after the human infrastructure of that monopoly had been destroyed. The civic legal record of who belonged to a city persisted long after the specific people who had been excluded were gone. Institutions have a kind of inertia that is not about belief. The people enforcing an institutional logic in 1928 did not believe they were acting on a decision made in 1349. They were not consciously continuing anything. The structure was doing the work without visible carriers.
And the inverse is true as well, which is maybe the less comfortable half of the finding. The cities where secular rulers protected Jewish populations, Avignon, Krakow, certain parts of the Low Countries, show the opposite pattern. not because those populations became more tolerant in some deep philosophical sense, but because the civic record was different. What had been normalized in those cities was a different category of civic membership. The protection Clement VI extended in Avignon, the protection Casimir extended in Poland, those were acts of territorial authority, not moral philosophy. But the record they left was of protection rather than exclusion, and that record also persisted.
300 years after Avignon, Montaigne, who had Jewish ancestry through his mother's family, Portuguese conversos, Jewish families who had converted to Christianity, many under pressure from the Inquisition, who carried their ancestry carefully and often privately, was writing essays in a city where the record of who was permitted to exist had been set differently than in Strasbourg. The chain of causation is long and indirect, but it is a chain.
Which connects to the thing about the plague's end that is still uncomfortable. The pandemic ended not because of anything humans did deliberately, not because of medicine, not because of public health policy, not because of prayer or penance or any of the explanations that were offered at the time. It ended because a species that medieval Europeans had identified as suspect, had tried to eliminate, had not successfully eliminated, that species quietly acquired resistance. Rats outlasted the pandemic. And the humans, who had not been able to understand the mechanism of transmission, who had built elaborate theological explanations for what was happening and elaborate moral explanations for who was responsible, who had organized programs and flagellant movements and statutes and university foundations and vernacular literatures, all of that human response to the plague was running parallel to a biological process in a different species that nobody could see.
What makes this remarkable is not the irony, it is the implication. The things that human institutions did in response to the plague, the things that left traceable consequences 6 centuries later, were responses to a mechanism that was invisible to them. The pogroms, the flagellants, the statutes, the universities, the migration east, the second serfdom, all of it was built on an incorrect account of what was happening and why. And the consequences were real. The structures that formed around wrong explanations became load-bearing elements of European civilization. They carried weight for centuries. Some of them are still carrying weight.
And that's still true today, because the question we keep asking about catastrophe is the wrong question. We ask, what did people do in response to this disaster? As if the response is the thing to study. The Voigtlander-Voth findings suggest the response is less important than the structure it leaves behind.
The pogrom lasted weeks. The legal and social record of the pogrom lasted 6 centuries. The flagellant movement was suppressed within 2 years. What it normalized about communal violence, about who bore responsibility for collective suffering, about the machinery by which a crowd could be assembled and directed, that outlasted every pope who condemned it.
The survivors built institutions around the hole where 40% of Europe used to be. The institutions they built were designed for a world that no longer existed, adapted to conditions nobody fully understood, and encoded assumptions about labor and knowledge and civic membership and religious authority that they would have been unable to articulate if asked.
And those institutions ran. They ran for generations. Some of them ran for centuries. The ones that collapsed did not collapse because people stopped believing in them. They collapsed when the material conditions they depended on finally shifted far enough that the structure could no longer hold the weight.
The plague ended. What it built did not.
Boccaccio died in 1375, 27 years after the Decameron. He spent much of those years trying to convince Petrarch that vernacular literature was a legitimate thing to have written. He almost succeeded. What survives is the book, and the censored edition, and a record of two writers arguing in Latin about whether it had been appropriate to write in Italian. The argument they were having was already over. The book existed. The language it was written in had already changed what was possible. The argument about whether it should have happened was the trailing edge of a world the plague had ended.
This is Pulse, Origins, produced by Singularity Pulse Network. Views expressed are our own. New episodes every Sunday. Follow us on @ThePulseSPN on X, the Everything app.
I'm Caden. The Pulse Brief is every weekday, 10 minutes. AI, space, crypto, cybersecurity, what matters most today? Find it wherever you listen.
I'm Knox. Every Saturday on Pulse Deep Dive, one story, the history, the present, and what comes next. Find it wherever you listen.